My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 29, a wedding photographer in Boston. I've captured hundreds of brides walking proudly with their parents, but when it was my turn, my parents told me my wedding was a worthless event for someone at the bottom. They didn't just skip it. They boarded a plane to Hawaii. On the very day I said my vows, they posted smiling photos on the beach, raising glasses under the caption, "Priorities." That night, while 70 guests filled the garden with cheers, I realized I was not only a bride without parents, but a daughter erased from her own family. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The June sun filtered softly through the trees, scattering golden light across the small botanical garden where David and I had chosen to be married. Rows of white chairs, curved neatly around the flower-draped arch, wild roses and lavender, releasing a sweet, calming scent into the air. 70 guests filled the space with low hums of conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. From the outside, it looked perfect, almost like the weddings I had photographed for years, except for the 2 glaringly empty seats in the front row. My eyes kept flicking to them as if I could will my parents to suddenly appear. The white programs we had set on each chair fluttered in the breeze, taunting me. They were supposed to be filled with the proud faces of Edward and Margaret Carter, but instead, the chairs stood vacant, reminding everyone of their absence. I swallowed hard and forced my shoulders back, desperate not to let tears blur my vision. Beside me in the bridal suite, Aunt Karen adjusted the lace on my dress and noticed my trembling hands. She leaned close, whispering firmly, "You are not alone today, sweetheart." Her voice carried both comfort and defiance, as if she were standing up to my parents on my behalf. Uncle Jack entered, then tall and steady in his navy suit. He extended his arm without hesitation. "Ready, kiddo?" He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes soft with reassurance. I nodded, unable to speak, and slipped my arm through his. As the music swelled outside, the gentle chords of a string quartet, the world seemed to pause. When the doors opened, sunlight bathed us in brilliance. Guests rose to their feet, turning smiling, waiting. I walked slowly down the aisle on Uncle Jack's arm, each step echoing louder in my chest than the last. I saw friends from college, clients I had photographed who had become close companions, and David's family smiling with genuine warmth. Yet my gaze always drifted back to the 2 chairs in the front, hauntingly empty, a wound on display for everyone. I forced myself to focus on David. He stood at the end of the aisle, tall and calm, his brown eyes filled with the kind of pride and love I had craved my entire life. He smiled when our eyes met, the kind of smile that anchored me to the earth. My heart steadied. I wasn't marrying my parents. I was marrying the man who had seen me, chosen me, and promised to stand by me. Still as I reached the arch and Uncle Jack placed my hand into David's, a memory surged unbidden. I heard my father's voice from 3 months earlier at their house in Hartford, sharp and dismissive. "Your wedding is a worthless event for someone at the bottom," the words seared into me like a scar. My mother had smoothed them over with her usual polished tone, but the meaning had been the same. My marriage, my happiness, my life meant nothing compared to Julia's conferences and Edward's social calendar. I blinked quickly, pushing the memory aside as the officiant began to speak. I repeated my vows with a steady voice, though a lump pressed in my throat. David's vows made the crowd laugh, then cry, then cheer, and for a moment the hollow ache in my chest eased. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause cheers rising into the branches overhead. The reception followed in the garden pavilion, strung with fairy lights. Guests clinked glasses, plates of food circulated, and David twirled me onto the dance floor for our first dance. I smiled, laughed, did all the things a bride was supposed to do, but there was always that shadow at the edge of my mind. Whenever I saw Aunt Karen beaming or Uncle Jack raising his glass, the empty seats of my parents appeared again in my imagination, stark and accusing. Later, while David was pulled away by a group of his college friends, I slipped outside for air. The evening had grown cooler, the scent of lilacs drifting across the lawn. I sat down on a stone bench beneath a maple tree, clutching my phone like a lifeline. I knew I shouldn't look. I knew it would only hurt more. But curiosity, or maybe hope, compelled me. Opening Facebook, I scrolled, my heart thudding. And there they were. My parents, my sister Julia, her husband Nathan, their 2 perfect children, all smiling on a beach in Maui. The first photo had been posted that morning, the caption written by my mother in her careful, curated style, "Perfect family without drama." The words sliced deeper than any knife. Picture after picture appeared: my father raising a glass of champagne at a beachfront restaurant, Julia laughing in her sundress with the children building sandcastles, my mother reclining on a lounge chair, sun hat angled just so. The comments beneath each post gushed. "What a beautiful family, you all look so happy. The perfect grandparents." Not one person asked where their younger daughter was. Not one comment mentioned that today was my wedding. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred. My throat closed and I felt as though someone had pressed all the air out of my lungs. My parents hadn't just skipped my wedding. They had replaced it. They had crafted a narrative, a shining portrait of family unity, deliberately excluding me. I closed my phone with shaking hands, my heart pounding in my ears. The celebration continued in the distance, laughter and music echoing across the garden. But sitting alone beneath the maple tree, I felt erased, as though I had never belonged to them at all. That realization settled heavy in my chest, a truth both devastating and oddly clarifying. And it was only the beginning. The house I grew up in sat proudly on a quiet street in Hartford, Connecticut. From the outside, it looked like something from a real estate magazine. A 2-story colonial with fresh white paint, a wraparound porch, and a perfectly trimmed hedge lining the walkway. Neighbors admired the manicured lawn, the symmetry of the shutters, the American flag that my father raised every Memorial Day. To them, it looked like the picture of stability and success. Inside, though, the order of things was different, and it was never left to chance. My father Edward and my mother Margaret ruled every decision. Just beneath them was my sister Julia, the eldest, and their golden child, their living proof that the Carter family was exceptional. And then there was me, always the afterthought, the filler, the one who never quite measured up. I can still see Julia's report cards pinned to the refrigerator door, row after row of A's circled in red, proud evidence of her brilliance. My parents would beam, inviting friends over for coffee, just so they could casually point them out. When I brought home my own straight A's one semester, my mother barely glanced before folding the paper and sliding it into a drawer. "That's expected." "Rachel not exceptional," she said, her voice cool and efficient. The difference between us was celebrated, not hidden. When Julia scored high enough to qualify for a prestigious science camp, my parents hosted a backyard barbecue with balloons and neighbors invited. I got a pat on the shoulder when I won the middle school photography contest, along with a reminder from my father: "Don't let this distract you from real subjects." By the time Julia was accepted into Yale for pre-med, our house turned into a stage. The dining room table was crowded with catered trays, bottles of wine, congratulatory cards from colleagues. My father raised a glass and announced, "This is what it means to be a Carter. This is our legacy." The guests cheered, and I clapped too, though a knot of something heavy sat in my chest. I wanted to feel proud, but what I felt was invisible. The contrast couldn't have been sharper 2 years later when I graduated from the University of Massachusetts with honors in fine arts. The ceremony fell on the same night as the hospital gala, where my mother was chairing a fundraising committee. She and my father chose the gala. They never saw me cross the stage. My roommate Olivia recorded it on her phone, and I sent them the video. They never responded. Even now, the memory of standing outside the stadium after the ceremony haunts me. Other graduates were gathering with parents who held bouquets, hugging them tight, snapping photos in the golden evening light. I waited by the gate, telling myself maybe they had left early from the gala to surprise me. But the parking lot emptied, and no one came. Eventually, I got into Olivia's old Honda Civic and drove back to our apartment in silence. The moments of recognition from my parents were so rare that I remember each one like a pressed flower in a book. Once in high school, I showed my mother a black and white photo I'd developed in the darkroom. It was of an old man feeding birds at the park light, catching his weathered hands. She looked at it for a long time, then finally said, "This is nice." For a second, my heart soared. But then she added, "Julia just published her research abstract. Did you see it? They're going to feature her at the science fair next week." My pride collapsed, replaced by the familiar weight of comparison. Every room in that house told the same story. The living room wall was a gallery of Julia-framed certificates, honor society photos, a glossy portrait in her white coat from medical school. There was one picture of me, taken at my high school graduation, my hair frizzing under the cap, squeezed onto the end of a shelf beside a vase of artificial flowers. Whenever I passed that wall, it felt like a silent reminder of where I ranked. I learned early to stay quiet at family dinners. My father asked Julia about her classes, her professors, her future surgeries. My mother leaned in, nodding eyes shining with pride. When the spotlight turned my way, it was only to ask practical things. How are your grades holding up, or what's your backup plan if photography doesn't work? My answers were short. My appetite gone. One night, I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. My father was on the phone in his study. The door was cracked open just enough for his words to reach me. "Rachel, she'll be fine. She's not like Julia. She's sensitive, emotional. She'll probably settle for something small." His tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive, like he was stating an inevitable truth. I remember pressing my back against the wall, fighting the urge to burst in and scream that I wasn't small, I wasn't worthless. But I didn't. I just went to my room, closed the door, and cried into my pillow. The older I got, the clearer the divide became. Julia's milestones were family events. Mine were inconveniences. Julia's achievements meant legacy. Mine meant nothing. That hierarchy never shifted, no matter how hard I tried. Standing in that house, surrounded by reminders of who mattered and who didn't, I grew used to the role of the outsider. But even as I tried to swallow it, part of me longed for the day they might look at me and see more than the leftover child. The truth, though, was simple. In the Carter family, there was no room for two daughters to shine. One had been chosen, and the other was there to be forgotten. And I was the one left standing in the shadow. In the fall of 2010, I moved into my dorm at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with a sense of both excitement and dread. My parents had allowed me to pursue fine arts, but only under strict conditions. I had to double major in business and keep my GPA above 3.5 or they would stop paying their share of tuition. I promised myself I could handle it, that I could balance spreadsheets by day and darkrooms by night. Most nights I lived that promise literally. I'd sit hunched over my desk at 1 a.m, finishing a financial analysis assignment, then switch to editing a batch of wedding photos I'd taken over the weekend. By 3 a.m., my eyes would burn, my fingers cramped, but I'd still be at my laptop chasing perfection in both worlds. My roommate Olivia, a psychology major with a quick wit and an unshakable sense of balance, often woke to find me still working. One night, she propped herself up on her pillow, hair tangled from sleep, and said, "Rachel, you know most people choose one thing to be good at, right? You're killing yourself trying to be everything." "I have to," I whispered, not looking up from the screen. "Why? For you or for them?" She pressed her voice soft but pointed. The question lodged in my chest. I didn't answer. Instead, I clicked through another photo, adjusting the light so the bride's smile glowed just a little brighter. My weekends filled quickly. Word spread among couples in the area that I was affordable, hardworking, and passionate. I rode buses to small-town churches, borrowed cameras when mine broke, stayed up late perfecting albums. Every paycheck went to covering my share of rent books and saving for better gear. I thrived in those stolen hours behind the lens, capturing fleeting looks and unspoken emotions. In my junior year, everything came together. I entered a regional photography competition on a whim, submitting a series I'd taken of an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary. The judges called it intimate, authentic, and deeply human. When the winners were announced, my name was listed first. The local paper ran a feature on me complete with one of my portraits splashed across the arts section. I carried a copy back to the dorm, hands shaking, convinced this was the moment I had been waiting for. For once, my parents would have to see me really see me. I mailed the article to Hartford with a note scrawled in my careful handwriting. Thought you might like to see what I've been working on. The phone rang that evening. My heart leapt when I saw my mother's number. I answered quickly. Hi, Mom, did you? Her voice was clipped, distracted. We saw your little article. It was nice. A pause, then her tone brightened. But have you seen Julia's piece in the New England Medical Journal? We sent you the link last week. It's groundbreaking work, Rachel. She's already getting invitations to conferences. I froze the newspaper spread across my lap. Yes, I said quietly. I saw it. Isn't it impressive, she continued, unaware of how my throat had tightened. She's really making a name for herself. I sent her flowers, I murmured. That's sweet of you, my mother said, then added. Anyway, we're off to dinner. Congratulations on your photos. We'll talk soon. The line went dead. I stared down at the grainy print of my photograph, the couple's faces lit with joy, and felt the weight of it collapse into nothing. My father never called. Julia never acknowledged the flowers. The article that had felt like proof of my worth became just another reminder of the gap I could never close. That night I folded the newspaper and slid it into the bottom drawer of my desk. Olivia found me there an hour later staring at the wall. They didn't care, did they? She asked gently. I shook my head, swallowing hard. Not enough to remember. She sat beside me, nudging my shoulder. Then you care. That has to be enough for now. I wanted to believe her. But as I lay awake in the dim light of the dorm room, the truth settled heavy inside me. No matter how many hours I worked, no matter how many people praised my photos in my parents' eyes, I would always be less. My victories would always shrink when placed next to Julia's. The next morning, I dragged myself to class exhausted, but when I picked up my camera later that day, a spark returned. Through the viewfinder, I found clarity even if no one else did. The world made sense when I captured it frame by frame, moments no one could erase or compare away. It was the only place I ever felt like I wasn't at the bottom. It was the summer of 2016 when I met him. I was photographing a wedding at a vineyard in western Massachusetts, running on too little sleep and too much caffeine, focused on catching every detail. The lace of the bride's gown, the trembling hands of the groom, the tearful smiles of parents. That's when I noticed one of the groomsmen, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm presence that seemed to anchor the whole room. The groom was a nervous wreck pacing the aisle before the ceremony, tugging at his tie. I lifted my camera ready to capture the chaos, but then I watched as the groomsman stepped in, placed a steadying hand on the groom's shoulder and whispered something that made him laugh. The tension melted from the room, and in that moment the shot I captured wasn't of nerves, but of friendship, of loyalty. The groomsman glanced up, and for a fleeting second our eyes met through my lens. Later at the reception, I kept finding him in my frame without meaning to. He bent down to help an elderly woman to her seat, carried her plate for her when she struggled with the buffet line. He joined the kids in a silly dance circle, clapping and laughing until they were all shrieking with joy. His smile wasn't forced, wasn't performative. It was genuine. When the evening wound down and I was packing my gear, he walked over. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly mussed, but his eyes held that same steady warmth. "You're the one who sees everything," he said. I blinked a little, caught off guard. "That's my job," I replied, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear. "To notice the moments no one else does." "Well," he said with a crooked grin, pulling a business card from his jacket pocket and scribbling his number on the back, "I noticed you too. In case you ever want to be on the other side of the camera," I laughed awkwardly, slipping the card into my bag, not quite ready to admit how much his words lingered. His name was David Miller. Our first date was at a small coffee shop just off the town green in Northampton. I expected awkward silences, but instead the conversation flowed as easily as the espresso. He told me about teaching 4th grade at a public school, how he loved watching kids discover their own talents. "You can see it in their faces," he said, leaning forward with that same light in his eyes I had seen at the wedding. when they finally get something when they believe they can do it. That's everything to me. I found myself smiling, leaning closer without realizing it. His passion wasn't about prestige or money. It was about impact, about people. And I realized I had never been around someone who believed so deeply in the worth of others. We began to see each other regularly. Walks along the Charles River, late-night phone calls, dinners where laughter came easier than breathing. With him, I didn't feel like I had to prove anything. He looked at me as though my worth was already decided, and it was more than enough. 6 months later, he asked if he could meet my parents. I hesitated, warning him it wouldn't go well. He insisted, if they're important to you, then I should at least try. We drove to Hartford on a gray Sunday afternoon. The house looked the same as it always had, pristine and proud. Inside, my mother greeted us with a polished smile that never quite reached her eyes. My father rose from his leather chair, shook David's hand once firmly but without warmth. "So you teach elementary school?" Edward asked, his tone flat like he was inquiring about the weather. "Yes, sir," David replied, unfazed. "4th grade?" "It's challenging, but I love it." My mother's eyebrows arched as she handed me a cup of tea. Teachers are so underpaid. I don't know how anyone manages to live in Boston on that kind of salary. Heat rushed to my cheeks. "Mom," I started, but David squeezed my hand under the table, silencing me gently. He smiled politely. "We make it work. I'm not in it for the paycheck. I'm in it because I believe every kid deserves someone who believes in them." The room went quiet. My father cleared his throat, uninterested. My mother shifted to talk about Julia's upcoming conference in New York, her research presentation, her growing reputation. David sat calmly listening, but I could feel the dismissal pressing down on me like a weight. On the drive back to Boston, I sat in silence, staring out the window, shame and anger twisting in my chest. David reached over, resting his hand lightly on my knee. "They didn't even give you a chance," I whispered, my throat tight. "It's not me they're disappointed in," he said softly. "It's anyone who isn't Julia, or anyone who isn't what they think success should look like. But Rachel, I need you to hear me. None of that matters. I see you. And you're incredible." The words cracked something open inside me. For years, I had bent myself into knots trying to earn recognition that never came. Hearing him say that, calm, steady, certain, was like standing in sunlight after years of shadows. I covered my face with my hands, tears spilling through my fingers. He pulled over, shifted the car into park, and turned toward me. "Hey," he said gently. "Look at me." I lifted my tear-streaked face. "You don't have to keep proving yourself to people who refuse to see you," he said. "You already are enough." That was the first time in my life I truly believed someone meant it. And sitting there sobbing into his shoulder on the side of the road, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for all the years I had spent begging for scraps of approval, and relief that finally someone saw me without asking me to earn it. It was the first weekend of October in 2022, the air cool and sharp with the smell of wet leaves and pine. David and I had driven up to New Hampshire to hike one of our favorite trails, a steady climb through woods that blazed red and orange. We stopped at the base of a waterfall where the spray caught the sunlight in tiny rainbows. I turned to take a picture, and when I lowered my camera, he was already on one knee holding out a simple gold ring that gleamed against the mossy rocks. "I don't have a speech," he admitted, his voice trembling just slightly. "All I have is this. I love you, Rachel, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it. Will you marry me?" I felt laughter and tears rise at once, so strong they choked me. My heart thundered, and all I could do was nod until I finally managed to say, "Yes." He slid the ring onto my finger, and the world around us seemed to vanish into rushing water and autumn light. On the drive back to Boston, I called my mother. I could barely keep my voice steady from excitement. "Mom, David proposed. We're getting married next June." There was silence on the line, followed by the sound of her adjusting something in the background. "June," she said finally. "That's a busy month. Your father has a conference and Julia's presenting at a symposium. We'll have to see. It's not a good time." I swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. "It's 9 months away. I wanted you to be the first to know." "Well," she said, her tone cool, "congratulations, I suppose. Send us the details when you have them." The call ended, leaving me with the hollow ache of déjà vu. Despite that, the planning began. David's sister Laura designed our invitations. Cream cards with pressed flowers. We toured a botanical garden just outside Boston and chose it for our ceremony, a space filled with wildflowers and shaded paths. We picked a simple menu of our favorite foods and asked a friend who was a pastry chef to bake the cake. Every piece of it felt intimate, meaningful hours. Still, a knot tightened in my stomach every time I thought about those empty chairs in the front row. David noticed. "We'll invite them," he said gently as we wrote names on envelopes at the kitchen table. "Give them the chance. Whether they come or not, that's on them. Come." 3 months before the wedding, I drove alone to Hartford. The house looked the same as it always had: white columns, immaculate lawn, the kind of perfection that seemed designed to impress rather than welcome. Inside, the walls were still crowded with Julia, her framed diplomas, professional portraits of her children in coordinated outfits, newspaper clippings about her medical research. There wasn't a single photograph of me. We sat in the formal living room, the one where children were never allowed to sit on the furniture. My mother poured tea into china cups and handed one to me like I was a guest, not her daughter. My father sat back in his leather chair, his posture stiff and commanding. "I wanted to talk to you both about the wedding," I began, my voice already shaking. "It would mean so much if you could be there. June 10th. The invitations went out weeks ago." My mother exchanged a glance with my father. She set her cup down carefully before saying, "Your sister's family will be visiting that weekend. We've already made plans." "Couldn't they come the weekend before or after?" I asked, quickly desperate. "It's my wedding day." My father's eyes narrowed. "Rachel, let's be honest. Julia is a surgeon with important responsibilities. Her schedule is limited. Your wedding—" He paused, searching for the word, and then delivered it like a blow. "It's trivial. A small event for someone at the bottom. We cannot rearrange serious commitments for that." The words stung so sharply I felt my hands tremble. My throat tightened until I could barely speak. "I'm your daughter too," I whispered. "Of course you are," my mother said smoothly, her smile tight. "But your little garden ceremony is hardly the event of the year. Perhaps if you had chosen a more substantial venue, or if David had a more established position." Like a doctor, my father finished almost casually. I set the teacup down before it shattered in my hand. "You're saying if David were Julia's husband, if this were her wedding, you'd come?" "Don't be dramatic," my father said, though the answer was written clearly across his face. Something inside me cracked. I tried to hold back, but tears spilled over, hot and humiliating. My father's voice cut deeper, sharp and final. "If David were a doctor, this would be different." That was it. The last thread snapped. I stood up, fumbling with my bag, desperate to leave that suffocating room filled with portraits of Julia, and not a single sign of me. My mother's voice followed me to the door. "Rachel, you're too sensitive. Always so emotional. This is why we worried about you in the arts. You have to toughen up." I didn't answer. I walked down the polished steps across the perfect lawn and into my car. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white as I fought to breathe. The words echoed in my head louder than the sound of traffic around me, worthless bottom trivial. And for the first time I realized they weren't just going to miss my wedding. They were never going to see me at all. The morning of June 10th, 2023 broke clear and warm, the kind of perfect summer day couples dream of for their weddings. The garden was alive with color, roses, peonies, hydrangeas bursting into bloom, and the air carried the scent of lavender drifting across the rows of white chairs. Guests murmured with delight as they settled in fans waving lazily in their hands. I should have been overwhelmed with joy, but my eyes went straight to the front row. 2 empty seats waited there, stark against the sea of filled chairs. Every time I looked, it was like a punch in the chest. Aunt Karen touched my arm lightly, her eyes fierce and kind. "Don't think about them," she whispered. "You're not alone. We are here." Uncle Jack gave me a steady nod, his hand warm and firm as I linked my arm through his. The music swelled, gentle strings filling the garden. And together, we began the walk down the aisle. My heart pounded louder than the violin, but I kept my gaze fixed on David waiting beneath the arch, his smile shining brighter than the sunlight. The ceremony itself passed in a blur. My vows shook only once when I promised to choose David every day for the rest of my life, and he squeezed my hands as if to say he'd already chosen me. The crowd cheered when we were pronounced husband and wife, confetti fluttering like soft rain over us as we walked back up the aisle. For a moment, I almost let myself believe that was enough. But at the reception, whispers drifted through the air like smoke. I heard them between toasts, caught snippets as I moved through tables. "Did you see their Facebook? They're in Maui right now. Such a beautiful beach." I felt the ground tilt beneath me. My phone buzzed in my clutch. Against my better judgment, I pulled it out. There it was. My father in a Hawaiian shirt raising a champagne glass on a balcony overlooking turquoise waves. The caption read in bold letters, "Priorities." The word stabbed deeper than any blade. I could almost hear his voice, dismissive and cold, telling me what truly mattered. My fingers trembled so violently I nearly dropped the phone. I stumbled outside away from the music and laughter to the edge of the garden where lanterns glowed faintly in the dusk. My chest ached, breath caught halfway in my throat. I stared at the photo again, scrolling through the stream of comments. "Perfect family vacation. So happy for you all. What a legacy you've built. Perfect family. Legacy. And not a single mention of me." A hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see Aunt Karen worry etched across her face. "Sweetheart, don't do this to yourself tonight. They didn't just miss it," I whispered, voice raw. "They made sure everyone knew why." Her eyes glistened. She pulled me into her arms, holding me against the steady beat of her heart. "Let them carry their shame," she murmured. "Don't carry it for them." I wanted to believe her. But as the music from the reception floated across the garden and the glow of lanterns lit the night, I couldn't shake the truth. My parents hadn't only skipped my wedding. They had erased me in public, replaced me with their perfect family on a beach thousands of miles away. And as I stood there in my wedding dress, the laughter of my guests behind me, I felt more like an outsider to my own blood than ever before. In August of 2024, barely a week after David and I returned from our honeymoon in Quebec, my phone began buzzing non-stop. At first I ignored it, thinking it was just clients eager for their wedding albums. But when I finally looked, I saw the same number flashing over and over again. My father's. 7 missed calls in a row. When I answered, his voice exploded through the line, sharper than I'd ever heard. "Where have you been?" "This is an emergency. The bank is threatening to sue over the Madison property loan. You need to transfer $200,000 immediately." I froze in the kitchen, the grocery bags I'd been unpacking slipping from my hands. "What are you talking about?" My throat went dry. "What loan?" "The Madison office building," he snapped. "The one you co-signed with me 3 years ago. They're calling the note. We've missed payments." "It's serious." My stomach dropped. Images from 2021 slammed back into my mind. Me sitting at his desk in Hartford, him sliding the papers across the leather surface. "It's just a formality," he'd said back then, his tone smooth and confident. "You have good credit, it'll help with the terms. I'll handle everything. You won't have to lift a finger." I had been so desperate for his approval that I signed without protest, telling myself it was a sign he finally trusted me. Now my pulse hammered as I realized what that trust had really cost. You said you were handling it, I whispered. You promised. I was handling it. He barked. The management company failed me. The building's half empty. Rent isn't covering the loan, and with our expenses, I had to make choices. Choices. My voice cracked. What kind of choices? He hesitated just long enough for the truth to seep in. I hung up and immediately called Leah, a friend from college who now worked as a real estate attorney in New York. She agreed to check the public filings and call me back. Those 30 minutes waiting were some of the longest of my life. I sat on the couch, knees pulled to my chest while David paced the kitchen. When the phone rang again, Leah didn't bother softening the blow. Rachel, I've looked at the records. Your father hasn't made a payment in 5 months. 2 were covered by a reserve fund early on, but that's gone. And the bank has every right to come after you since you're a co-signer. I pressed my forehead into my palm, the room spinning. How bad is it? Your credit score has already taken a hit. From what I see, you've dropped from about a 780 to around 660. That's significant. It'll affect any refinancing credit cards, even your business loans if you need them. And if the bank files a lawsuit, they'll come for both of you. You need to act fast. David crouched beside me, his hand steadying my arm. Ask her what the money was used for, he said quietly. I swallowed, dread crawling up my spine. Leah, is there a record of what happened to the funds? There was a pause. Rachel, she said carefully, I can't give you everything without a subpoena. But I can tell you this, the withdrawals line up with some large personal expenses, airline tickets, luxury accommodations, tuition payments. None of it looks related to the property itself. The blood drained from my face. Airline tickets, Hawaii. I could see it clearly now. Those smiling photos of my parents, Julia and her children on the beaches of Maui, posted the very same month the first missed payments appeared. They used the money. I whispered, my voice trembling. They used it for the trip, for Julia's kids' school. They let my name go down with the loan while they toasted champagne in Maui. David's hand tightened around mine. His jaw clenched, anger flashing in his eyes. Rachel, this isn't just mismanagement, this is betrayal. I couldn't speak. My chest heaved, my ears roared. For years I had fought to prove to my parents that I was more than an afterthought, and now their carelessness threatened to undo everything I had built. My business, my credit, my future. All of it could collapse because I had believed them when they said they would take care of it. I leaned back against the couch, numb, the words echoing again in my father's voice, sharp and dismissive. Your wedding is a worthless event for someone at the bottom. And now apparently so was my future. I sat in a quiet conference room in Manhattan, the kind with polished wood tables and a view of the Hudson blurred by gray clouds. The attorney slid a folder toward me. Here's everything we pulled, she said. Withdrawals, transfers, the timeline. There's no ambiguity. Your father diverted money from the building accounts into personal expenses. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Airline charges to Maui, tuition checks to a private academy in West Hartford, luxury retail charges. The very months he'd assured me everything was handled. When I left the office, the city noise pressed around me. Horns, blaring heels clattering on pavement. But all I could hear was the rush of blood in my ears. I stepped into a side street, pulled out my phone, and called my father. He answered on the first ring. Rachel, he barked. Tell me you've arranged the transfer. We can't wait any longer. The bank wants payment in full on the arrears. I drew a breath so deep it hurt. I've reviewed the records, Dad. I know what you did with the money. You stopped paying the loan the same month you booked the Hawaii trip. That's irrelevant. He snapped, his voice rising. The family is $200,000 in debt, and you have a responsibility to help. You benefited from that loan, too. No, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I never saw a dime. You told me it was a formality. You told me you'd handle it. His tone hardened. "Stop being naive. This is bigger than you. If you don't cover this, your credit will be destroyed. You'll never get a business loan, never buy a bigger home. You'll drag David down with you. Is that what you want?" The words hit like blows, each one calculated the same weapon he'd used my entire life. Fear, shame, control. My chest tightened, but I forced myself not to flinch. "You once said my wedding was worthless," I said slowly, every syllable deliberate. "Well, this debt, it's worthless to me. I won't pay for your choices." Silence, then an explosion of fury. "You ungrateful child, I raised you, I gave you everything. And now when we need you, you gave me conditions." I cut in, my voice rising for the first time. "Approval only when it made you look good. Support only if it matched your definition of success. But when it mattered to me, when I needed you to show up, you chose the beach." There was a ragged pause. I pictured him in his study, red-faced, gripping the phone. "Rachel, this is not the time for petty revenge," he growled. "This is about family duty. I am done being the safety net you never believed in." I said, my throat tight, but my words sharp. "I have an attorney. I have options, and I will protect myself. You will not use me again. Don't you dare walk away from this," he roared. "You'll regret it. You'll see what happens when you turn your back on your own parents." I closed my eyes, inhaled once, then pulled the phone from my ear. His voice still thundered, distant now, like a storm I was stepping out of. I hit end call and let the silence settle around me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trembling because of him. My hands shook with adrenaline. Yes, but beneath it was something new, a flicker of strength I had never let myself claim. I had said no. I had stood my ground. I tucked the folder of evidence into my bag, straightened my shoulders, and walked back into the noise of the city. For once, I felt taller than the weight of his voice. The backlash came faster than I expected. Within 24 hours of ending that call with my father, my phone was vibrating non-stop with messages from relatives who had clearly been fed one version of the story. The first was from Aunt Sophia, my mother's older sister. Her voice, usually honeyed, was sharp with disapproval on the voicemail. "Rachel, I can't believe what I'm hearing. How could you abandon your parents in their time of need? Family comes first, always. You should be ashamed of yourself." I deleted the message, halfway through, my pulse spiking. A moment later, another notification buzzed, this time from Robert, her son. His voice was angrier, harsher. "You're unbelievable, Rachel. Dad says Uncle Edward is drowning and you just hung him out to dry. Everyone knows you're being petty because of the wedding. Grow up." I threw the phone onto the couch and buried my face in my hands. David sat beside me, silent for a moment, then rubbed circles on my back. "They don't know the truth," he said gently. "They're repeating what your parents want them to believe." But the words still cut deep. It was the same pattern as always. My parents controlled the narrative, and I was left to look like the selfish one. The worst came 2 days later. Julia called. I nearly declined it, but some part of me wanted to hear what she would say. She didn't even bother with a greeting. "You need to stop this nonsense, Rachel. You're making everything about you again." "Again," I repeated, stunned. "You've always been jealous," she snapped, "of my career, my family, the way Mom and Dad are proud of me. And now you've found some ridiculous excuse to punish them. It's pathetic." The familiar burn rose in my chest. Jealous Julia. I begged them to come to my wedding and they chose Maui. They raised a glass on the beach while I walked down the aisle with Uncle Jack. How exactly is that jealousy? "They had commitments," she shot back. "You know how hard it is to coordinate my schedule. Nathan's the kids. You expect the whole world to stop for you." My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "No, Julia. I expected my parents to show up for the most important day of my life. Instead, they made it clear who really mattered to them." There was silence on the line, the kind that hummed with unspoken truths. I pushed harder. Tell me, Julia, was that vacation really more important than your sister's wedding? For the first time, she didn't have a ready answer. I could hear her inhale sharply, then exhale. You're twisting things, she muttered, her confidence faltering. I don't have time for this. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone with a mix of anger and a strange satisfaction. I hadn't convinced her, but I had forced her to sit with the truth she avoided. The isolation grew as more distant cousins unfollowed me on social media, and messages from family friends dripped with judgment. For a moment, I wondered if I really was the villain in their eyes. The weight of being misunderstood pressed down until I could barely breathe. Then came the unexpected voices. Danielle, my cousin on my father's side, texted me late one night, "I know how this feels. I walked away from them years ago." You're not crazy, Rachel. You're brave. Uncle Peter. My father's younger brother left a voicemail. I won't get in the middle, but I want you to know I admire how you've built your life. Not many people stand up to Edward, but you did. That takes courage, and Aunt Karen, steady as ever, called me the next morning. Sweetheart, you did what you had to do. Don't let them twist it. Your parents have always played favorites. It's about time someone refused to play along. Hearing her say it broke something loose in me. For years I had felt like the lone voice shouting into a void, trying to prove I wasn't less. Now for the first time I realized I wasn't alone. That night I sat at the kitchen table with David, scrolling through the hateful messages and then the supportive ones, and I felt a shift. The sting of rejection was still there, but it was tempered by a new awareness. I had allies, however few, and maybe that was enough. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the extra piece of the puzzle no one wanted. I felt like someone worth standing beside. In January of 2024, the call came in the middle of a gray afternoon. Aunt Karen's voice was tight, holding back tears. Jack's gone. Heart attack. They couldn't save him. I sank into a chair, my hand pressed against my chest. Jack had been the one who walked me down the aisle, who stepped in when my father chose absence over presence. The thought of never hearing his steady voice again hollowed me out. 2 weeks later, David and I flew to Chicago for the funeral. The church was filled to the brim, every pew lined with neighbors, colleagues, and old friends. Jack had lived simply but left behind a legacy of kindness, the kind of man people remembered for fixing their fences, showing up at their kids' games, and never letting anyone leave his house hungry. David and I slipped into a row near the back beside Aunt Karen. Her eyes were red, but her hand was warm and strong when it found mine. At the front, my parents sat upright, Julia and her family beside them, the picture of composure. Their heads inclined graciously when mourners passed, as if the whole event were a stage, and they were the dignitaries in attendance. Whispers floated around the sanctuary. That's Rachel, isn't it? The one who wouldn't help Edward with the loan. Such a shame. Family should stand together. The words slithered into my ears, stinging, even though I knew where they came from. My parents had wasted no time crafting their version of events. I kept my eyes fixed on the coffin draped in white lilies, refusing to give the whispers power. After the service, mourners filed into the reception hall next to the church. Tables groaned under trays of casseroles and cakes, the kind of spread that said Midwestern funeral more than anything else could. I found myself in the kitchen arranging paper plates with Karen when my mother appeared in the doorway. Her expression was unreadable, her lips pressed thin. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so only I could hear. Rachel, perhaps. Perhaps we were too harsh. About the wedding. I froze the plastic serving spoon in my hand, hovering over the tray of potatoes. What are you saying? She looked down at her fingers, twisting her wedding band. We should have come. It was wrong of us. I see that now. 100 responses rushed to my tongue. The years of dismissal, the hollow seats at my ceremony, the champagne glasses raised in Maui. Instead, I met her eyes and said quietly, I don't need your apology, Mom. I've already proven my worth, with or without you. The words were steady, but my pulse roared. It was the first time I had spoken to her without begging, without pleading for recognition. A movement caught my eye. Julia stood in the hallway just beyond arms, folded her gaze like ice. She had heard every word. Her mouth tightened, and for a moment I thought she might intervene. Instead, she turned on her heel, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, and walked away without a sound. The silence she left behind was heavier than any argument. My mother sighed, adjusted the tray of cookies in her hands, and slipped back into the crowded hall, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the echo of my own words. I set down the serving spoon and pressed my palms against the counter. My chest rose and fell in jagged breaths. For years, I had wondered what it would feel like to finally stand on equal ground with them. Now I knew. It felt like walking out of a cage I'd lived in my whole life. And yet even with that flicker of strength, Julia's cold stare lingered in my mind long after the day was over. Late in December of 2024, after hours of labor under the harsh white lights of a Boston hospital, I heard the thin, piercing cry of my daughter for the first time. The nurse laid her on my chest, her skin flushed pink, her tiny fists clenched. My whole body shook with exhaustion, but the moment her eyes fluttered open, something inside me cracked wide open. David leaned close, tears streaming down his face as he kissed my forehead. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Rachel, she's perfect." They cleaned her and wrapped her in a soft blanket, then placed her into David's arms. He held her as though she were made of glass, his shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. I had never seen him like that, raw, undone. His parents arrived the next morning, their faces shining with joy. Linda pulled out a pair of tiny knitted booties she had made herself, pressing them into my hands. For Lily, she said, her voice breaking, "She'll always know how loved she is." Charles hovered behind her, misty-eyed, mumbling, something about already planning to build a crib for when she stayed overnight. For the first 2 weeks, we existed in a bubble of sleepless nights, soft cries, and awe. I had never been so tired, but also never so whole. Lily's presence filled every corner of our apartment, her scent of milk and powder clinging to everything, her cries commanding our entire world. Then came the message from my parents. My phone buzzed late one evening, and I stared at the text until the letters blurred. "We'd like to come meet Lily. Tell us when it's convenient." My stomach nodded. I had imagined this moment 100 times, dreaded it, longed for it, feared it. When I showed David the message, he squeezed my hand. "What do you want to do?" I thought carefully before replying. "Only if you respect our boundaries. This is our home, our rules. If you can accept that, you may come." The next Sunday, they arrived at our apartment. I watched from the doorway as they stepped in, suddenly looking older than I remembered. My mother clutched a velvet box, my father carrying a bouquet of pale winter roses. Their eyes darted around the small living room, nothing like the grand Hartford house they were used to. I held Lily close to my chest as I greeted them. "Remember what I said. You're here as her grandparents, not as the people who get to make decisions for us." "We understand," my mother said quickly, her voice softer than usual. They sat awkwardly until finally my father asked, "May I?" gesturing toward Lily. My arms tensed, but slowly I placed her into his. For a moment he seemed almost lost, as though he didn't know what to do with something so fragile. Then he looked down, his stern face softening in a way I had never seen. "She has your eyes," he murmured. He traced a finger gently over her cheek before whispering almost to himself, "That stubborn chin. It will serve her well, just like her mother." The words stunned me. I searched his eyes, looking for sarcasm, dismissal, anything familiar. But for once there was none. Just recognition, a reluctant kind of pride. My mother opened the velvet box and revealed a tiny silver bracelet. "This was mine as a baby," she said, her voice catching. "I thought she should have it now." I nodded, accepting the gift, though part of me stayed on guard. It was easy to hand over heirlooms. It was much harder to undo a lifetime of wounds. As they sat there cooing over Lily, I felt 2 opposing truths settle over me. For the first time, my father's eyes held something close to respect. And yet I knew that didn't erase the years of being invisible, the sting of that word, worthless, thrown at me like it was nothing. So I let him hold her. I let my mother watch her sleep. But I kept my boundaries firm, my heart cautious. Because even in that moment of fragile peace, I knew forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. 2 years later, life looked nothing like the one my parents had once predicted for me. My wedding photography business had grown beyond anything I imagined. What started as long nights hunched over my laptop in a tiny apartment had become a full studio in downtown Boston with a gallery space where our best work hung on the walls. Couples came in coffee in hand, pointing to photos and saying, "That's the feeling we want." When Brides Today released their spring 2025 issue, my photo graced the cover. I stood in line at a bookstore holding that glossy magazine in my hands, my name printed in bold letters, and felt a quiet, steady pride. David's career had flourished too. He'd been promoted to lead teacher at his school, entrusted with designing a new curriculum that wove art and creativity into the core of every subject. Watching him light up as he described his ideas, seeing his students thrive under his guidance, it made me love him even more. Our dinner conversations often turned into brainstorming sessions, his chalk-dusted hands gesturing wildly while Lily babbled in her high chair. Our apartment in Boston wasn't big, but it was ours. The walls were filled with photographs of Lily's first steps, her messy birthday cake face, and snapshots from our weekend trips to the coast. There was laughter echoing through those rooms' toys scattered underfoot, the kind of chaos that meant life was being fully lived. Meanwhile, word trickled back to me about my parents. The grand house in Hartford with the white columns and manicured lawn had been sold. The mortgage and upkeep had become too much, especially with their dwindling savings. They moved into a condo closer to Julia, smaller and quieter, stripped of the grandeur they had once clung to. Neighbors whispered and colleagues speculated about what had happened to the Carters, who had once seemed untouchable. I didn't revel in their struggles, but I couldn't ignore the irony either. They had built their lives on appearances, and those appearances had crumbled. The very image they sacrificed me to protect had collapsed under its own weight. One evening after Lily had gone to sleep, I sat on the balcony with David, the city lights flickering below us. The spring air was cool, carrying the scent of rain. He leaned back in his chair, sipping tea, and asked quietly, "Do you ever think about them? About how things turned out?" I looked out over the skyline, my heart calm in a way it had never been when the subject of my parents came up. Sometimes, I admitted. They once told me my wedding was a worthless event for someone at the bottom. And for a long time I believed them, that I was at the bottom. But look at us now. I gestured toward the warm glow of our apartment, the muffled giggles of Lily in her sleep drifting through the open window. I have love, I have a family, I've built something real. That's more than they ever gave me. David reached over, threading his fingers through mine. "You proved them wrong," he said simply. And he was right. Every choice I had made to honor who I was, every step I took away from their approval and toward my own worth, had been the proof. I thought back to the empty chairs at my wedding, the sting of being erased from my own family. Those moments had once defined me, though. Now they were just part of the story, a beginning to the life I chose to write for myself. I leaned my head on David's shoulder, the city lights blurring into stars. For the first time, I didn't feel like the forgotten daughter or the afterthought. I felt whole, steady enough. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told you didn't matter, I hope my story reminds you of this. Your worth isn't decided by anyone else's standards. It's yours to claim, to live, to prove in your own way. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been underestimated and found a way to rise above it? Share your story. I know someone out there needs to hear it. Because sometimes the best revenge is simply living a life so full of love and purpose that no one can ever call it worthless again.